Good day, y'all. This is Kevin Mann again. I'm here for, I believe, the fourth episode. Let's talk a little bit more about pseudoscience and science. Just a reminder that science is based on rigorous analysis, while pseudoscience is based on casual observation. So, of course, the science is based on empirical evidence, and of course, the pseudoscience is based on anecdotal evidence. So, we say that science can be tested, and we say pseudoscience cannot be tested. I'll show you exactly what I mean by that in just a moment. But before I do, let's dive a little bit deeper into maybe Elon Musk. So, who is Elon Musk anyway? Do you admire Elon Musk? Well, Elon Musk, of course, he started out in maybe like 1971. He was born in South Africa, and of course he has a long history of being pretty revolutionary. I mean, he seems to be a man of great thought, insight, and innovation. So so my question is, do you admire people like Elon Musk? Yes or no? I think many of us do admire people like Elon Musk because we're thankful to some of the innovations that they bring to the table, some of the maybe conveniences or some of the progress that we can and development that we might see in, say, certain industries, things like this. So, if I ask, why do you admire people like Elon Musk? Some of us may have different answers. There will probably be some answers that some of us may consider a little more shallow, for the, winning the game of capitalism or acquiring all the toys of being a billionaire and having acquired a lot of money, things like this. People might actually answer. I don't, but that's not to say that your answer is wrong. Your opinion, you're entitled to it. So I would never criticize you for your opinion. You're entitled to your opinion. But Elon Musk, of course, brought us SpaceX, Tesla, and of course, basically Twitter. So he, I think he offered like over $3 billion more than what the share price was. He offered like $44 billion, and I think it was only at the time like maybe $42 billion or something like that, like 9.2% more than what the share price was. So if the board of directors of Twitter, how can you turn down a 9.2% basically interest like in just overnight? So I'm sure their stockholders were probably up in arms when he offered that kind of money, because they're like, you better accept it, because you have a fiduciary responsibility to me, your stockholder, right? So they probably demanded that you go ahead and let him purchase it. Of course, Elon Musk did go to a TED Talk. Here he is saying to the effect of why he felt it was so important to invest in Twitter, or to buy X as we know it today.
What I'm saying is this is not a way to sort of make money. I think it's just that I think my strong intuitive sense is that having a public platform that is maximally trusted and broadly inclusive is extremely important to the future of civilization.
But you've described yourself.
I don't care about the economics at all.
Well, so my next question then is, what do you think? Do you believe Elon Musk? Why or why not? Could it be that all these things he says, I mean, he seems to be saying the same things that we would actually want him to say, because we're like, my gosh, we're tired of all these lies. We're tired of the FBI, and we're tired of the CIA, and we're tired of, so all these agencies and departments basically telling us things that we can even acknowledge today, as like even the NIH or the CDC basically promoting or propagating things that we clearly can recognize as being false. And we're like, well, why are they propagating this well, I would say pseudoscience. Why are they propagating pseudoscience at the CDC? Why, why would we even allow it? But I digress. What do you people hope for? So what is wishful thinking, in other words? So if we have wishful thinking, does it give us hope? Hope is, I guess, another word we could say maybe kind of like faith, because if we have faith that something is going to happen without proof, is it kind of like hope that these things are going to happen without proof? So, Bertrand Russell, he warned future generations about wishful thinking. He was asked specifically, do you have anything to tell future generations, or to basically forewarn? And he said, well, I have two things. One was a logical or rational truth, and the other was more of a maybe moral truth. And, well, I'll let him tell you.
I should like to say two things, one intellectual and one moral. The intellectual thing I should want to say to them is this. When you are studying any matter or considering any philosophy, ask yourself only what are the facts and what is the truth that the facts bear out. Never let yourself be diverted either by what you would wish to believe or by what you think could have beneficent social effects if it were believed. But look only and solely at what are the facts. That is the intellectual thing that I should wish to say.
So who coined the term conspiracy theory? So conspiracy theory, if you look at it, it was coined, the term, by the CIA, and it was coined in this document. I don't have the exact number, but if you notice the date on the document, on the CIA 1035-960 PDF, that memo, it looks like it says April 1st, 1967. However, if we look further at the scientific method, you notice wishful thinking is not part of the scientific method. In other words, what Bertrand Russell was warning us about was the fact that, just because you want it so badly, you want to believe that Donald Trump or Elon Musk is here to help. It's kind of like when Hogan's Heroes, when Hogan is telling them, okay, we'll just go ahead and we'll pretend to have this escape plan. Since that's what the Nazis were expecting, they said, okay, we'll give them what they expect, but then we'll have a secondary plan to truly escape. It's the same concept. So if you can kind of give people what they are expecting, and what we like to believe that someone within the government is actually going to cooperate and going to maybe even foment, or maybe to encourage, or maybe even act as a catalyst to actually facilitate this great awakening, or this paradigm shift that we want, that we all desperately want in our country, in the United States. This paradigm shift might just depend on us, because Donald Trump betrayed us. Elon Musk probably will betray us. So is it just wishful thinking that maybe I'm like, yeah, Elon Musk, he's doing it because, he can see that, we deserve better. And quite honestly, maybe you're right. Maybe, I'd love to think that Elon Musk and Donald Trump and all these people are doing it for us. But it's just like when people say, well, God helps those who help themselves. Of course he helps the people who help themselves because they're actually doing something about it. Because if there is no deity, there is no God, then of course they are the ones actually facilitating it. They're facilitating that success or that success for themselves. They are not depending on some wishful thinking. They're not depending on their prayers. They're not depending on their thoughts or their ideology. They're basically acting upon it. Actions speak louder than words. Actions speak louder than beliefs. So if you only have your wishful thinking and you're not willing to act upon it, then you are basically just going to succumb to, whatever someone else is actually willing to act upon. So it's just ideology. It's just dogma. Wishful thinking is not part of the scientific method. As Bertrand Russell says, you need to focus on, the facts. Focus on, the empiricism. That's how you will, correct things. That's how you will adjust things. That's how you improve things. Albert Einstein, on the other hand, he said, imagination is more important than knowledge. For knowledge is limited to, oh God, this is so small. For knowledge is limited to all we now know and understand, while imagination embraces the entire world and all there ever will be to know and understand. Albert Einstein said that. So what's he essentially saying? In other words, how did he come up with those thought experiments? How did he come up with these ideas that were so far outside the box? Duality of light, relativity, and things like this. So how did he come up with these ideas? Speculation, conjecture, imagination are integral parts of the scientific method. In other words, how will you ever think of anything new? How will you ever invent? How will you ever innovate unless you're willing to think outside the box? How will you ever be able to improve and grow and mature without being able to find some way new, without using that imagination to actually come up with a way to improve the existing process or the existing invention? You need innovation. And of course, the innovation relies on speculation, conjecture, and imagination. Otherwise, how would we ever invent or innovate? Conspiracy theories or speculation, they are conjecture. They are using our imagination to try and resolve, why do we have these discrepancies? Why do we have these anomalies? Why do the official stories of our government not add up? It's almost every story that they tell us is full of anomalies. Let's look at Karl Popper. Karl Popper, again, like I said, a theory that explains everything, explains nothing. I'll let him explain it. Actually, here's James Corbett of the Corbett Report, and he can say it so much better than I can. I'll let him tell you.
One of the giants in the history of the philosophy of science, Karl Popper, once famously observed that a theory that explains everything explains nothing. And to be sure, the theory of catastrophic anthropogenic climate change appears to explain everything. After all, we all know that climate change makes for shorter winters, except for when it makes for harsher winters, and climate change means less snow, except for when climate change means more snow, and climate change causes droughts in California and floods in Texas and Oklahoma, and generally makes wet places wetter and dry places drier, except when it makes wet places drier and dry places wetter, and climate change causes more hurricanes at the same time as it causes less hurricanes. Climate change causes more rain but less water, and less rain but more water. Climate change decreases the spread of malaria at the same time as it increases the spread of malaria, but don't worry, the Terminator himself advises us not to listen to those climate change cynics. Hey guys? Do I need to go on? Oh, okay. Climate change makes San Francisco foggier. Climate change makes San Francisco less foggy. Climate change causes duller autumn leaves. Climate change causes more colorful autumn leaves. Climate change makes for less salty seas. Climate change makes for saltier seas. Climate change causes the polar ice caps to melt. Climate change causes the polar ice caps to freeze. Climate change makes the Earth hotter, unless the Earth isn't getting hotter, in which case climate change can explain that too. What's the problem here? This sounds like the perfect scientific theory. It can explain literally everything, including self-contradictory things.
However, catastrophic anthropogenic climate change is what's disputed. Nobody's disputing that climate changes. Nobody disputes that weather changes or temperature changes. That's not the issue. The issue is the catastrophic anthropogenic climate change. In other words, anthropo, human, genic, made, so it's man-made climate change. The warming period that we find ourselves in today started in 1700.
You have a PhD in ecology, correct?
That is right. And actually, when I started my PhD in ecology, the word was not yet in the popular press. Well, Stephen, first, there is actually no proof that we are causing the warming. There's a number of reasons to say that the evidence is actually against the hypothesis that we're causing the warming, because there's been warming and cooling cycles all through the history of life, and some of them are longer than others. Like the last ice age before this one was 300 million years ago, and then it was warm for nearly 300 million years before it got cold again like it is now. So that's a big cycle. But there's smaller cycles, and the ice age we're in now has cycles called major glaciations, which there have been over 20 of in the last 2.5 million years when the ice age set on in the northern hemisphere. Ice came in the southern hemisphere many million years earlier because it's completely different. But the Earth has cooled gradually in fits and starts for the last 50 million years. We are at the tail end of a 50 million year cooling period, and that is well known, and the graphs are available on the internet to show you that just after the time of the dinosaurs, well, 15 million years after the time the dinosaurs went extinct, the Earth was at its hottest in hundreds of millions of years.
Sure.
The Eocene thermal maximum. Everybody knows about it. They just ignore it.
Everyone knows about the thermal maximum. What are you,
Yeah,
a moron,
exactly.
Jared? Okay.
The only warming period we're in now is from 1700, at the peak of the Little Ice Age, or the depths of the Little Ice Age. So there's two reasons why additional CO2 in the atmosphere are entirely beneficial. The first is a slight warming would be beneficial, and it doesn't look as though there's going to be anything more than a slight warming. The catastrophists just exaggerated out of all proportion, and doom and gloom, the end is nigh, the world is coming to an end in 10 years if we don't do something. 10 years later, it hasn't happened, and then they predicted again, because people forget that they predicted 10 years ago that it was going to be gone in 10 years. The ice caps are still there. Al Gore predicted they'd be gone a few years ago. They're still there, and then he's saying it again now.
Yeah.
Right? Exactly the same thing he said before, which did not come true, and they get Nobel Peace Prizes for this. It's all through history. People have honored those who proclaim doom is coming. So I don't understand. I'm not a psychologist. It must have something to do with psychology.
It didn't start after the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is attributed to around 1860, around the American Civil War in Great Britain. This whole idea that anthropogenic climate change is attributed to our activities, and besides, who says carbon is even a pollutant anyway? I mean, carbon, they predicted with the greenhouse effect back in the 1970s, they said that crop yields to go down. But honestly, crop yields have gone up since the carbon has gone up. In other words, they've had a greening of the planet. It seems that plants actually enjoy, carbon dioxide.
First of all, it's very difficult to separate the science from the politics. And second, even if the more radical claims are true, we have no idea what to do about it. It's the kind of low-resolution thinking that just gets us absolutely nowhere. I like what Lomborg did way better. I think it's way more intelligent. So, maybe if you increase child nutrition enough and you produce another, 10 million geniuses as a consequence of that, and maybe one of them will figure out what to do about global warming. Well, I'm serious about that, It's not a bad thing to increase the total sum of human brain power, And so we treat these things so lightly. Well, let's fix the planet. Well, we're going to concentrate on global warming. Well, why global warming? Well, because everyone thinks that's the biggest catastrophe. Well, maybe it is, but if you don't have a solution, well, and then what about all those other problems? What are you going to do about them? Well, we'll ignore them because we can feel good about, being concerned about global warming. It's like, One of the reasons, there's more trees in the northern hemisphere than there were 100 years ago. No one knows that, but it's true, and by a substantial margin. You know why, in part? Because people burned coal instead of wood. It's like everyone says, well, we shouldn't burn coal. It's like, okay, fair enough. What do you want to do, burn trees instead? Because that's what poor people would have done. It's like, coal isn't good. Well, it's better than burning wood. So these things are complicated, and we're not going to do a damn thing about it either. So it doesn't really matter. So, well, what are we going to do? You're going to stop having heat? You're going to stop having electricity? You're going to stop driving your cars? You're going to stop taking trains? It's like, you're not. You're going to stop using your iPhones? You're not going to do any of that. And no wonder. So no.
So this whole prediction they made about catastrophic anthropogenic climate change have been wrong. So how many predictions have they made about their catastrophic anthropogenic climate change? Well, if you remember back in 2001, when Al Gore had his Inconvenient Truth, in that movie he basically said we'll have an ice-free Arctic in by 2012, or 2013, and by the 2012 rolled around, he said, oh, no, I meant 2015. Then when 2015 rolled around, he said, oh, no, I meant 2018. Wrong. In other words, every prediction they ever made about the Arctic being ice-free has been wrong. I mean, they keep, like I said, they keep cherry-picking their data. They keep basically moving the goalpost. They basically keep, oh, well, we were wrong about that date. Let's move the goalpost again, so that way, but they keep doing it. So how long have they been actually doing this? They've been basically telling us that the sky is falling. They've been Chicken Little since 1921. If you look, October 3rd, 1921, in the New York Times, they actually published a story in the New York Times over 100 years ago about how, millions to die in the 1921 heat wave. Did they die? No, they didn't. However, if you look in the last, say, 100 years, since they've been giving us these predictions, they've made over 40. I actually made this PPT back in 2018. So that's been 8 years ago. So this is actually old data, but they've made at least 40 predictions, basically speculating or guessing, or predicting that, this is what this global warming, this catastrophic anthropogenic climate change is going to lead to. And have any of their predictions ever come true? Not a one. Not a single one. So you better be able to give me some kind of metric. If you can't give me some kind of metric that I can measure it, because if you're basically telling me that this is my theory, and then you don't give me some kind of way to measure to determine how precise or how imprecise or how accurate or how inaccurate your theory is, it's not measurable. That's what Karl Popper is talking about. If you don't give me some kind of metric where I can show you how accurate or inaccurate, so we can tweak your theory, because as a man of science, I need and encourage you to scrutinize my theory, because if you can help me improve my theory, you can help me make my theory better and more accurate. So I encourage actually dissent. I encourage challenges to my theory. Unlike these pseudoscientists who basically are like, oh, no, I know the science. Don't question it. That's dogma. That's ideology. That's not science. That's like religion. In other words, they're basically stipulating to you what to believe. Don't question it. Don't do your own research. So you better give me some kind of metric where I can measure it. So I can take distance, these different ways of measuring distance, and I can take time. And then, of course, I can even take variants of these different types of diagnostics, these metrics, and I can basically find distance divided by time is velocity. So I can come up with different combinations of these metrics to actually find other ways of measuring speed and other things, other attributes of the world around me. However, before I go further, I'd like to give you this one model. There are 32 families of computer models used throughout the international community. And if you notice on this chart, 31 of the 32 families are like way, way, way high. I mean, because if you look, it's like they're saying because this goes off the chart, of course, but if you look, it'll go far to the right by 2070, because the chart actually only goes to like 2020 maybe. But if you go to 2070 and you look at the curve on that trajectory, you're like, my God, maybe it will be 2 degrees centigrade warmer by 2070. Oh my God, they're right. At least 31 of the 32, family of models predicting, what's the environment or the ecology of the planet going to look like in, 50 years or so. Then you're like, oh my God, it is going to be 2 degrees centigrade warmer. However, if you look at the actual empirical data, in other words, these are models. The things that you put into your model is what determines how accurate your predictions can be. So if I'm making or putting in erroneous or fake or false or mistaken data into my model, maybe I'm not putting the right barometric pressure or the right temperature or the right humidity or the right elevation, whatever it is that I am messing up in my, I'm not comparing apples to apples. Maybe I'm comparing apples to oranges because I'm using different elevations or I'm using different things that you are. But so if I'm not putting in my variables correctly, and there's a lot of variables we can put into these models. So if I'm not putting some of these variables in correctly, it's going to come back with an erroneous reading. So if you look at the data, though, the data is the average, weather balloons is the green circles. The blue squares are, of course, the satellite data. That's from the satellites in orbit. And, of course, the diamonds is what we call reanalysis. In other words, the reanalysis is basically the two data sets combined from both the satellites and the weather balloons, and they basically reanalyze it and combine those two data sets together and get a third, more accurate reading. And so that's why we do reanalysis of those two data sets. So these models that they've combined, if you notice, they're way down in the, way down further south in this chart. Why? Well, if you notice, I don't know if you can really see it, there is one line. There's one blue line way down that's basically on the same trajectory as all the data. That's the Russian model. That's the Russian model. How did the Russians get it right when 31 of the other 32 families of topographic or tropospheric temperature variation models and observations, how did that get so messed up with 31 of the 32? But if one got it right, that means everybody else probably could have too. So why was only one model for this tropospheric model able to get it right? It comes down to money, people. Same thing. We can say the same thing about COVID-19. In other words, you assemble a erroneous model, and you basically tell everybody, oh, well, this COVID-19, it can actually has an incubation period of 14 days, 2 weeks. Oh, my God. That's unheard of. Of the 36,000 viruses that we have cataloged on the planet Earth, we basically, there's only none of them have basically a incubation period or where you can show asymptomatic for like 14 days. None of them. So the fact that they were saying, well, this thing has an incubation period of 14 days, that's justification for the lockdown, people. That's justification for the lockdown. Because remember, 2 weeks to flatten the curve is what they told us. But then they also said, oh, yeah, this thing has an incubation period. Well, it's so robust, it can live 5 days on like a brass doorknob. Remember that back in like January or maybe even December 2019. But they, as we were getting threatened by China about this, COVID-19, all of a sudden, people were talking about, oh, this thing can live like 5 days on a doorknob outside of a human host. The thing is, that was proven within just 2 months, just a few months later, that was proven, no, that's not true. It's typical, like a regular virus. A typical virus can only live outside the body, human host, on a brass doorknob for about 24 hours, not 120 hours. So these data points that they kept giving us in their models were wrong.
Does it necessitate shutdown, loss of jobs, destruction of the oil company, furloughing doctors? In the ER through swine flu and through bird flu, did we shut down for those? So from what we're seeing right now, it's time to open back up. The science says it is. The models we have been using from predictions to predict the amount of disease are not accurate. This information is accurate. It models the flu. Let's go back to work. That's what the data is saying. Not models. Data is saying that.
R naught factor, their incubation period, their robustness or the virulence of the disease. If you look at Dr. Chris Centeno, I knew that COVID-19 was a psyop by March 14th, 2020. How did I know? Because Chris Centeno was given an interview by Dan Bongino I believe it was March 13th, the day before. So I happened to see it the next day. He posted it, and I happened to see that, oh, okay. So he basically, I'll let him say it.
So if you look at the mortality rate for this, the coronavirus, what is it? And that's the billion or the $1 trillion question right now. So if you look at what that is, outside of Wuhan, China, it was 0.4% with a fatality rate. If you look at the new German data that actually just came out today, it was 0.2%. If you look at the cruise ship data, it was 1%. So you're starting to see some clusters there around 1% or less. And if you look at the flu, what's the mortality rate of the flu in the elderly, which is what this seems to affect more than anything, it can be, again, quite high, about 0.5% to 1%.
That's important, Doc. You brought something up about the Diamond Princess, and it's in one of your articles at Regenics, again, which we'll post for our audience in the show notes at Bongino.com for you to read. You write that the Diamond Princess creates kind of an interesting case study. Closed environment, who's on the ship and who's not, obviously. And you talk about that in one of your articles, how that study leads you to believe that some of the mortality rates and the death rates, being reported are maybe exaggerated. Can you just explain what you meant by that with regards to that specific cruise?
Yeah, so the Diamond Princess cruise starts in Wuhan, China. It starts in the epicenter of the coronavirus outbreak. And it goes around, does its thing for a month, and then it docks in Japan. So we know that there were at least one, if not more, infected people on that cruise. Because a week before it docked, finally, there was a guy that got off in Hong Kong, and he tested positive about 6 days later for the coronavirus. So we have 4,000 people in a closed environment with a shared air handling system, with shared spaces. If you've ever been on a cruise, you can't get away from it. You've got stairways with handles, you've got elevators, you've got common areas where everyone eats or circulates through different areas where people eat. And so that gave us this really interesting environment to look at, albeit in a slightly older population, because cruisers tend to be about 10 years older on average than the U.S. population. but it gave us an environment to look at how bad this thing was.
But your point in that, and it's in the article again, we'll post, folks, is that in this controlled environment, if this was a contagion like we'd never seen before, with an R0, an infection rate off the charts, then more people on that ship, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you're the expert, should have gotten sick. Not saying a lot of people did, it's infectious, no doubt about highly infectious, but again, we're talking about not if it's serious or not, how serious. Am I right there that if it's as dramatic as everybody was making it out to be, more people should have come down ill?
Yeah, there were 17%. So they tested everyone. Unlike everything we're seeing in the media right now, they tested everyone on that ship and everyone who got exposed. And 17% of the people on that ship ended up contracting this after a month. So as you might imagine, if you look at even the flu pandemics, normally if you test everyone in the population in an area that's affected, it's 20 to 40% of the population that will test positive for the flu. Obviously, some people shrug it off, no big deal. Some people get a bit sick, and a few people get really sick. So that was the first thing that set my mind a little bit at ease with this whole thing, was that 17% number, not 50%, not 80% after a month, but 17% in a pressure cooker of a flu spread machine called a cruise ship.
So as you can see, the models, if they're built erroneously, you can convince anyone of almost anything that the sky is falling, that somehow, catastrophic anthropogenic climate change is real. You can convince people that COVID-19 was much more virulent than they ever imagined. But like I said, all these data points proved to be incorrect, proved to be wrong. The models were wrong, not the data. The models were wrong. It's the models where they set up the PSYOP. It's the models where they set up the false flag. It's the models, in other words, they're giving you expectations. They want you to expect certain things. What's normal in this situation to expect. And they purposely want your trajectory to go off the chart. That's a regular PSYOP, people. That's a regular PSYOP. All right, but just to remind you that pseudoscience, based on, believe me, is their mantra. Well, science proved me wrong. So that's why I say today, prove me wrong. Do your own research. Reinvent the wheel if you have to. I don't care. Just do your due diligence. Do your own research. Do your own reading. So, pseudoscience is based on dogma and ideology. But that's today why I want to look at astrology and astronomy. Because I want you to see something that this goes hand in hand with what Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock have been talking about. Because if you look at the seasons, it's just a cycle, right? We talk about how absolutes do not exist in this universe. Almost everything seems to be cyclical. So you can see this cycle of seasons, spring, summer, fall, and winter. So we're actually taught that our ancestors had a very rudimentary analysis or view of the world around them. In other words, before them to be able to plant crops, they had to understand this cycle. If they didn't understand a time to plant crops, a time to harvest, these cycles would repeat every year and allowed them to actually plant and harvest on a cycle. If they didn't understand this, they would not have been successful with their cultivation and harvesting of their crops. So we are given this narrative that, okay, around 15 to 25,000 years ago, they did acknowledge this seasons, maybe even the solstices. So the sun's path on the planet Earth, if you notice, when the sun is directly over the equator, it is basically the equinoxes. But when the sun is at its farthest point north, I believe it over the Tropic of Cancer, when the sun is over the Tropic of Capricorn at its southernmost point, that is, of course, the solstices. because as you know, our Earth is at a 23-degree lean. So if you look at the the equinoxes, of course, are the the autumn or the spring equinox. That's when we can say, because according from the Greek, equi, equal, nox, night, from the goddess of night, they basically are saying your daytime and your nighttime are equal length. So out of your 23 hours and 56 minutes, it's not really 24 hours as you know, of those times in your day, you have equal amount day and equal amount night. And it only happens like twice a year. However, when we have twice a year also, when we have maybe the longest day or the longest night. And of course, those are our solstices. So June 20th, 21st, or December 21st, 22nd are either our longest day or shortest day, respectively. And of course, so if we look at the March 21st and September 23rd are our equinoxes. So remember, this is something we all acknowledge today as, well, they had to have some rudimentary, because we do acknowledge that some of these structures that we have found, like Stonehenge and, Gadang Badang, and I know I'm not pronouncing it right, and Göbekli Tepe, these places are oriented. Some of these places actually have buildings that are oriented toward true north, or so they are, these were pretty sophisticated. But if we look at astrology, of course, is the pseudoscience. In the pseudoscience, they basically tell us that, we can look at these 12 constellations and we can basically predict for you, who your potential partner is, who is most compatible with you, where you'll meet, how you'll meet, what job is best for you, and maybe even give you investment advice. I'll let you listen to this young lady. Don't recall her name, but anyway, just give you an idea of what she's talking about.
Here's how to use astrology to see what career you should be going into. There are 3 steps to this, so feel free to pause this video at any point to get the info that you need for your chart. You're going to need to pull up your chart using whole sign houses, and you're looking for the MC, also known as the midheaven. That MC, that is the midheaven, it represents public image and career.
Well, I doubt she even knows where they chose the 12 constellations. But do you know where how many constellations are in the night sky over Earth, both north and southern hemisphere? 88. 88. So, of these 88 constellations in the night sky, how did they choose the 12? Even though she, as a astrologer, she probably has no idea how they chose them. But today, we scientists, astronomers, we know how they chose those 12 constellations. And we didn't choose them. We're talking about ancient peoples chose these 12. So how did they choose them? If you look in the night sky, you notice these constellations, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, I think Sagittarius. If you notice, it's a line. It's a line in the sky, right? It's a line in the sky. So, and then of course this is, well, that was an actual picture, but this here is a computer-generated picture. And if you notice, this is also Pisces, Aquarius, and Capricorn. But again, it's a line. It's a line in the sky. So what is this? What's going on? In other words, there's something called the precession of the equinox. Precession of the equinox, is, of course, is if you take a top and you put a laser on that axis of your top and you spin it with a lot of energy, and just, it's really got a lot of energy. And you basically put it down, that laser, it will just point to a point, a dot on the ceiling. But as that top loses energy, you notice it will start to wobble. As that top wobbles, that laser on that axis, what does it do? it no longer draws or points at one dot. It draws a circle. On the ceiling. It draws a circle. That is the line you see in the sky. That line is actually part of the circle. And the circle is known as the precession of the equinoxes. Because if you look due east on March 21st, say just before sunrise, and watch the sunrise come up, you'll notice there is a constellation marking that sunrise on March 21st. Y'all remember the movie 2012? In 2012, they said, oh, the world's going to come to an end. Where did they get that idea about the world coming to an end? They actually got it from the Mayan calendar. But the Mayan calendar doesn't say the world's going to come to an end. It says the end of an age, not the end of the world. So before 2012, you had the age of Pisces, where for the previous 2,000 years, that Pisces, that constellation marked the sunrise on March 21st. Around 2012, we now say, well, it's the age of Aquarius, because the age of Aquarius is now marking that sunrise. And for the next, say, 2,000 years, it will be marked by Aquarius. So we're now in the age of Aquarius. So we didn't acknowledge this or see this until recent, science and development and technology and techniques to measure it. Our different diagnostics to able to detect this move, because you're talking about this movement. The typical human lives only 80 years. Well, how fast does this thing rotate? How soon, if it's going to say 2,000 years on one constellation, okay, so there's 12 constellations, 360 degrees in a circle, so that means you're talking about 30 degrees each constellation. So that constellation is only going to be in place or it's only going to move 1 degree every 72 years. What? That's why it's so hard to detect, because it takes almost a human lifetime just to move 1 degree. But with our science and our computers and able to set up models to where we can either fast forward or reverse or rewind what we're actually observing and see the movement, we're like, oh, that's what's actually going on. We actually can speed it up in our computer models. So, okay, this one cycle around that 360 degree circle is called the Great Year. That takes approximately almost 26,000 years just to go through one complete cycle. So how did as many as 200, because as far as we can tell today, there are probably 200 ancient civilizations that knew of the precession of the equinoxes. How did all these ancient peoples know precession of the equinoxes? How was that even possible? We couldn't even detect it until we had our advanced science and tools to measure it. So how did they do it? So when like I said, you have Randall Carlson, who can talk a little bit more about what is history? What are some of these theories of Graham Hancock? And he'll lay it out here for the Dryas, but about 12,000 years ago, 12 to 15,000 years ago, the megafauna all disappeared about 15,000 years ago.
If we started recreating maps, going backwards, like taking snapshots of the planet every millennium, going back, what we would see is that going back to 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, the basic configuration of our planet would not change much. Once we get 11, 12, 13,000 years ago, the changes become profoundly dramatic. We start seeing sea levels going down hundreds of feet. We see massive ice sheets covering North America and Europe, and lots of other enormous changes. You know, we modern humans have been on this planet for 150 to 200,000 years at least. If we think of a generation of humans as 25 years, that's 7,000 generations of humans. Wow. Right? Now, so the question is what were we doing for all those thousands of generations until somebody finally realized, hey, you know what? We can plant crops. We can build cities. We can form communities. You know, we can invent language, et cetera, et cetera. Well, my contention is, and I think the evidence that's accumulating supports this interpretation, that what we're really seeing 7, 8, 9,000 years ago is not the origins of civilization, but the rebooting of civilization. Modern history is separated from deep history by this extraordinary series of events that transpired between about 11 and 13 or 14,000 years ago. Once we begin to recognize how extreme these events were in remodeling our planet, totally remodeling our planet, it then becomes obvious to us why there is not a lot of hard evidence for whatever went on prior to these events.
And there's been some things that they've found since then that have really sort of made Graham Hancock's theories become more and more palatable to even mainstream scientists.
Yes.
Like Göbekli Tepe.
Exactly. Göbekli Tepe, Gunung Padang. Well, my contention is, and I think the evidence that's accumulating supports this interpretation, that what we're really seeing 7, 8, 9,000 years ago is not the origins of civilization, but the rebooting of civilization.
And of course, Randall Carlson is one of the only people I know of who actually asked these questions about the megafauna. So, you know, we today think of ourselves as the top of the food chain, but just 15,000 years ago, we were not top of the food chain.
What's further interesting is when we look at this graph. This is the late Pleistocene mortality graph, and each square represents a fossil specimen of an extinct mammal. Could be a woolly mammoth, could be a giant ground sloth, could be a saber-toothed cat. Roughly 120 species of megamammals that lived during the Ice Age went extinct at the end of the Ice Age. And basically, what this graph is showing us here is that the left side represents 50,000 years ago. Here, where the cursor is, that's 40,000 years, 30,000, 20,000. Each one of these squares represents the finding of a fossil of an extinct mammal. What we see from this graph is that when we get to between 11 and 13,000 years ago, there's a massive spike, shoots through the roof. This demise of these animals directly coincides with this right here. What we're dealing with is that for 50 years, the dominant theory is called overkill or blitzkrieg. And this theory basically states that bands of Paleo-Indian hunters came across the Bering Land Bridge, slaughtering every animal that they encountered along the way, and somehow within less than 1,000 years swept from Siberia down to Tierra del Fuego and killed off every mammoth in the world, and presumably every other of the extinct mammals. And that has been the dominant theory, that humans caused this mass extinction.
So it's only been in the last 15,000 years we've been at the top of the food chain. It's actually a pretty recent development. But that's what it will look like if you basically look at, on March 21st, at dawn, basically Aquarius will be marking that constellation. Graham Hancock has a very interesting question, though.
Here's the thing. You're an ancient Egyptian. You're building an equinoctial marker in 2500 BC. Do you know what constellation is housing the sun in 2500 BC?
I haven't run the little program.
Well, it's the constellation of Taurus. So logically, if you're making an equinoctial marker in 2500 BC, you really should create it in the form of a bull, not in the form of a lion. You know, that's the puzzling issue. And yet we do have a time when a lion constellation housed the sun at dawn on the spring equinox, and that is the period of the Younger Dryas.
So as you can see, what Graham Hancock is actually talking about is he's asking, why'd they shape it in the form of a lion? What he's actually referring to is this. He's saying 2012 became, Age of Aquarius. Previous 2,000 years was Age of Pisces. So it's actually, as you can see above, I have it written up there, 2,160. So it's actually almost 2,200 years, actually, per constellation. But if you notice, about the time 4468 BC, when they say that the Egyptians built the Sphinx, it would have been in the Age of Taurus. However, when it was Age of Leo, that's like 6,000 years. 6,000 years prior to Age of Taurus. So he's making a point here that, well, if this is an equinoctial marker, why'd they make it a lion if it was built in the Age of Taurus? It doesn't make sense. That is another anomaly. I will just mention this before I go, because like I said, we have been talking about and have been focusing on science and pseudoscience, but I'll just mention to you lastly about the noble lie. Book 3, Plato's Republic, he recalls a story in Plato's Republic where he talks about the noble lie. However, about 100 years before Plato's Republic, in Book 3 mentions the noble lie, Themistocles, like I said, it's like 100 years before. He mentions, remember, Themistocles was a general at Marathon. He saw the Persians at their first invasion. But then he tried to tell the people of Athens, wait a minute, the Persians are probably going to return. And one thing he learned at the Battle of Marathon was that, we might have a superior army, but if the Persians come back, we're going to need a navy that can counter their navy, because the thing is, the Persians are going to they're going to be moving troops with their navy. And so they could actually flank us, say at Thermopylae maybe, that land people behind us. Of course, he didn't know about Thermopylae. That came later. But in 480 BC, or BCE, you had, of course, the Battle of Thermopylae. They did return. Wasn't Darius anymore. It was his son, Xerxes or whatever. And so at 483 BC, they found a copper mine. I want to say it was a silver mine. The reason I want to say it was a silver mine, even though my slide says copper mine, is because people were going to get about, I think, 10 drachmas a piece or something like that. In other words, that's a lot of money. Back in 2,400 years ago, that's a lot of money. And I'm pretty sure it was probably a silver mine, not the copper mine. But this allowed them, by discovering this mine, they were now going to be able to pay for their navy. So he got lucky. So how did he convince his fellow Athenians to use this money they acquired? Because like I said, if they had distributed the money, every family in Athens would get like 10 drachmas or 20 drachmas. It was a lot of money. However, how did Themistocles convince his fellow Athenians to basically build the navy? He lied. He basically told them that there was another island off the coast of Aegina, I believe it was, basically telling them, or telling the Athenians that the Aegeans are basically going to pirate our, transport ships. So we need a bigger navy. And you know what? It worked. So even though that was a lie, within 3 years, Persia came back, and of course, we all know the rest of the story. Thermopylae, if it wasn't for that noble lie, could the entire Greek world come to a crashing end. Who knows? But actually the first example we have of the noble lie is like 2,400 years ago. Hopefully this helps you understand just what we're facing in this world of science and pseudoscience. Hopefully you understand that this is not something isolated. This is a large part of human history, but the internet and smartphones are the game changer. You deserve the truth. Or next episode we'll talk about Thomas Paine.